Throughout history, a number of evil experiments have been carried out in the name of science. Science saves lives often. Sometimes scientists commit horrific crimes in order to achieve results. Welcome to King Jimsta. We're counting the top 10 craziest experiments on humans. Separating triplets. In the 1960s and 1970s, clinical psychologists led by Peter Neubauer ran a secret experiment in which they separated twins and triplets from each other and adopted them out as singlets. The experiment, said to have been partly funded by the National Institute of Mental Health, came to light when three identical triplet brothers accidentally found each other in 1980. They had no idea they had siblings. The child psychiatrists who headed up the study, Peter Neubauer and Viola Bernard, showed no remorse, according to news reports, going as far as saying they thought they were doing something good for the kids, separating them so they could develop their individual personalities, said Bernard, according to Quillette. As for what Neubauer learned from his secret evil experiment, that's anyone's guess, as the results of the controversial study are being stored in an archive at Yale University, and they can't be unsealed until 2066, NPR reported in 2007. Neubauer published some of his findings in a 1996 book, Nature's Thumbprint: The New Genetics of Personality, primarily concerning his son. Nazi medical experiments. Perhaps the most infamous evil experiments of all time were those carried out by Joseph Mengele, an SS physician at Auschwitz during the Holocaust. Mengele combed the incoming trains for twins upon which to experiment, hoping to prove his theories of the racial supremacy of Aryans. Many died in the process. He also collected the eyes of his dead patients, according to the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum. The Nazis used prisoners to test treatments for infectious diseases and chemical warfare. Others were forced into freezing temperatures and low-pressure chambers for aviation experiments, according to the Jewish Virtual Library. Countless prisoners were subjected to experimental sterilization procedures. One woman, Ruth Elias, had her breasts tied off with strings so SS doctors could see how long it took her baby to starve, according to an oral history collected by the Holocaust Museum. Japan's Unit 731. Throughout the 1930s and 1940s, the Japanese Imperial Army conducted biological warfare and medical testing on civilians, mostly in China. Led by General Shiro Ishii, the lead physician at Unit 731, the death toll of these brutal experiments is unknown, but as many as 200,000 may have died, estimates historian Sheldon H. Harris according to a 1995 New York Times report. Numerous diseases were studied in order to determine their potential use in warfare. Among them were the plague, anthrax, dysentery, typhoid, paratyphoid, and cholera, according to a paper by Dr. Robert K. D. Peterson for Montana University. Numerous atrocities were committed, including infecting wells with cholera and typhoid and spreading plague-ridden fleas across Chinese cities. According to Peterson, the fleas were dropped in clay bombs, which were dropped at a height of 200 to 300 meters and showed no trace. Prisoners were marched in freezing weather and then experimented on to determine the best treatment for frostbite. The Monster Study. In 1939, speech pathologists at the University of Iowa set out to prove their theory that stuttering was a learned behavior caused by a child's anxiety about speaking. Unfortunately, the way they chose to go about this was to try to induce stuttering in orphans by telling them they were doomed to start stuttering in the future. The researchers sat down with children at the Ohio Soldiers and Sailors Orphans Home and told them they were showing signs of stuttering and shouldn't speak unless they could be sure that they would speak right. The experiment didn't induce stuttering, but it did make formerly normal children anxious, withdrawn, and silent. Future Iowa pathology students dubbed the study the Monster Study, according to a 2003 New York Times article on the research. 3 surviving children and the estates of 3 others eventually sued Iowa and the university. In 2007, Iowa settled for a total of $925,000. The Burke and Hare murders. To the anatomist Dr. Robert Knox, to who Burke and Hare supplied the bodies of their victims. Until the 1830s, the only legally available bodies for dissection by anatomists were those of executed murderers. Executed murderers being a relative rarity, many anatomists took to buying bodies from grave robbers, or doing the robbing themselves. Body snatching as a professional occupation didn't really start to take shape until the end of the 18th century. Susie Lennox, the author of Body Snatchers, Digging Up the Untold Stories of Britain's Resurrection Men, told all about history in an interview. Up till then, the students and anatomists would have carried out their own raids in graveyards, acquiring cadavers as and when they could. Surgical experiments on slaves. James Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, whose experiments on slaves continue to cause controversy. James Marion Sims, the father of gynecology, whose experiments on slaves continue to cause controversy. The father of modern gynecology, J. Marion Sims, gained much of his fame by doing experimental surgeries, sometimes several per person, on slave women, according to The Atlantic. Sims remains a controversial figure to this day, because the condition he was treating in the women, vesicovaginal fistula, caused terrible suffering. Women with fistulas, a tear between the vagina and bladder, were incontinent and were often rejected by society. Sims performed the surgeries without anesthesia, in part because anesthesia had only recently been discovered, and in part because Sims believed the operations were not painful enough to justify the trouble, as he said in a lecture according to NPR. Guatemala syphilis study. Many people erroneously believe that the government deliberately infected the Tuskegee participants with syphilis, which was not the case. But the work of Professor Susan Riverby recently exposed a time when the U.S. Public Health Service researchers did just that, according to Wellesley College. Between 1946 and 1948, Riverby found, the U.S. and Guatemalan governments co-sponsored a study involving the deliberate infection of 1,500 Guatemalan men, women, and children with syphilis, according to The Guardian. The study was intended to test chemicals to prevent the spread of the disease. According to Michael A. Rodriguez in a 2013 paper, the experiments were not conducted in a sterile clinical setting in which bacteria that cause STDs were administered in the form of a pin-prick vaccination or a pill is taken orally. The researchers systematically and repeatedly violated profoundly vulnerable individuals, some in the saddest and most despairing states, and grievously aggravated their suffering. Those who got syphilis were given penicillin as a treatment, Riverby found, but the records she uncovered indicate no follow-up or informed consent by the participants. The Tuskegee study, the most famous lapse in medical ethics in the United States, lasted for 40 years. In 1932, according to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the U.S. Public Health Service launched a study on the health effects of untreated syphilis in black men. The researchers tracked the progression of the disease in 399 black men in Alabama and also studied 201 healthy men, telling them they were being treated for bad blood. In fact, the men never got adequate treatment, even in 1947 when penicillin became the drug of choice to treat syphilis. It wasn't until a 1972 newspaper article exposed the study to the public eye that officials shut it down, according to the official Tuskegee site. The Stanford Prison Experiment. Philip Zimbardo, whose controversial Stanford Prison Experiment continues to generate interest. Philip Zimbardo, whose controversial Stanford Prison Experiment continues to generate interest. In 1971, Philip Zimbardo, now Professor Emeritus of Psychology at Stanford University, set out to test the nature of human nature, to answer questions such as, what happens when you put good people in evil situations? How he went about answering his human nature questions was and is thought by many to have been less than ethical. He set up a prison and paid college students to play guards and prisoners, who inevitably seemed to transform into abusive guards and hysterical prisoners. The 2-week experiment was shut down after just 6 days because things turned chaotic fast. In only a few days, our guards became sadistic and our prisoners became depressed and showed signs of extreme stress, Zimbardo stated, according to Times Higher Education. The guards, pretty much from the get-go, treated the prisoners awfully, humiliating them by stripping them naked and spraying their bodies with delousing chemicals and generally harassing and intimidating them, according to the Stanford Prison Experiment site. The Aversion Project. They didn't like gay people in apartheid-era South Africa, especially in the armed forces. How they got rid of them is shocking. Using army psychiatrists and military chaplains, who were, presumably privy to private, confidential, confessions, The apartheid regime flushed out homosexuals in the armed forces. But it did not evict them from the military. The homosexual undesirables were sent to a military hospital near Pretoria, to a place called Ward 22, which in itself sounds terrifying. There, between 1971 and 1989, many victims were submitted to chemical castrations and electric shock treatment, meant to cure them of their homosexual condition. As many as 900 homosexuals, mostly 16 to 24 years old who had been drafted and had not voluntarily joined the military, were subjected to forced sexual reassignment surgeries. Men were surgically turned into women against their will, then cast out into the world, the gender reassignment often incomplete, and without the means to pay for expensive hormones to maintain their new sexual identities. That's it for today's video. Subscribe for more videos.